There are mornings when the world breaks open with its usual dependable clarity, yet the man stepping into it finds himself operating behind an invisible veil of lead. He wakes expecting the crisp mechanics of routine, the familiar weight of the feet hitting the floor, the reliable ignition of purpose, the clean slate of a new dawn. But nothing lands right. The morning air feels slightly too dense to breathe. The light through the window pane has a dull, uncooperative glare, rather than its customary invitation. To the outside observer, the shift is entirely imperceptible. He ties his shoes with his habitual efficiency. He pours his coffee with steady hands. He exchanges standard pleasantries with a colleague or a partner, his voice modulating to the exact frequencies required by social convention. No sirens wail. No catastrophic telegram arrives on the mahogany table. There is no shattered glass, no sudden betrayal, no dramatic financial ruin to point a finger toward. Yet, beneath the polished veneer of functionality, a quiet hemorrhage of vitality is underway. Conversations feel marginally off-key, like an instrument tuned just a quarter tone flat. A simple exchange about project timelines or household logistics requires an ungodly expenditure of will, as though he is pushing a heavy stone up a slippery incline of sand. Even the smallest tasks, answering an elementary email, selecting a shirt from the closet, signing a routine document, possess a gravitational pull, entirely disproportionate to their actual mass. They are heavy, they drag. By the time the sun reaches its zenith and begins its long, unhurried slide toward the horizon, the exhaustion is no longer merely physical. It is an existential hollow. He is not just tired in the way a laborer is tired after hauling timber. He is unsettled in a manner that defies linguistic articulation. It is a strange, phantom ache of the spirit, the unsettling sensation that somewhere between the first waking breath and the twilight hours, the moorings have slipped. The ship is still floating, but the anchor is dragging across an uncharted, jagged floor, and nobody else on deck seems to notice the friction. Why does the human machine, finely tuned by evolution and sharpened by ambition, occasionally seize up in the complete absence of external trauma? Why do we suffer profoundly when nothing is actually wrong? To dissect this phenomenon, one must apply recursive thinking. We must ask why the mind registers invisible resistance, and then interrogate how that registration curdles into a pervasive sense of failure. At the root of the psychological descent is a fundamental category error, the misattribution of biological or atmospheric flux to personal deficiency. Modern consciousness is addicted to narrative. We are storytelling animals who demand a villain, a plot twist, or a moral lesson for every emotional state we occupy. When a man experiences a sudden, inexplicable drop in neurochemical vitality, perhaps induced by microfluctuations in sleep architecture, subtle dietary shifts, barometric pressure drops, or simply the natural ebb and flow of the human endocrine system, his narrative-hungry mind refuses to accept a biological explanation. "Why do I feel hollow?" the mind whispers. "Because something must be broken," it answers. This is the recursive trap. The mind demands a causal link between how it feels and what is happening in reality. If reality presents no objective hardship, if the bank account is stable, the family is healthy, and the career is advancing, the mind panics at the vacuum of cause. To fill the vacuum, it turns its lens inward. It begins to scan the internal horizon for ghosts. How does this scanning manifest? It manifests as hypervigilance. Every minor hesitation in a conversation is reinterpreted as social awkwardness. Every delayed thought is diagnosed as cognitive decline. The mind takes the baseline static of being alive, the friction inherent in navigating a complex, demanding world, and magnifies it through a lens of profound suspicion. Philosophically, this reveals a profound vulnerability in the modern ego, our dangerous dependence on continuous, frictionless momentum. We have been conditioned by an efficiency-obsessed culture to believe that human output should be linear, upward, and endlessly scalable. We treat our minds like high-performance sports cars, expecting them to roar into the red line every single morning without fail. When the engine sputters despite pristine fuel, we do not check the weather or allow the oil to settle. We immediately assume the chassis is cracked beyond repair. We mistake a temporary meteorological anomaly in our internal climate for structural collapse. Consider the life of Master Thomas, a renowned stone carver in late medieval Florence, whose hands were legendary for their ability to coax breath out of cold marble. For 40 years, Thomas had lived by the rhythm of the quarry and the chisel. He knew the temperament of stone, as a sailor knows the moods of the Mediterranean. On a Tuesday in late autumn, Thomas stepped into his workshop just as the pale morning light cut through the high clerestory windows. He selected a block of Carrara marble, flawless, white, and yielding, and picked up his mallets. From the very first strike, something was profoundly wrong. The marble felt unyielding, almost malicious under the steel. His wrist didn't snap with its usual liquid grace. His shoulder felt encumbered by an invisible burden. When he aimed for a delicate fold of drapery on a statue of a statesman, his hand hesitated for a microsecond. The chisel bit a millimeter too deep, gouging a scar into the marble face of the fold. A lesser apprentice would have cursed the stone or thrown the tool across the room. Thomas simply stopped. He stood in the cool, dust-heavy silence of the workshop, staring at the ruined fold. In that quiet space, the trap opened beneath him. His mind, unbidden, began its dark calculus. "You are losing your eye," the internal voice murmured. "Your hands are trembling. The decades of labor have finally curdled your gift. You are old, Thomas. You are finished." He looked back over his life, instantly weaponizing his past successes against his present moment. He remembered every flaw he had ever corrected, every commission that had taken too long, every tired evening, and reframed them all not as normal human labor, but as a long, slow accumulation of decay. By noon, without a single soul entering his workshop to criticize him, Thomas sat on a low stool with his head in his hands, utterly defeated by a ghost of his own making. Yet, what Thomas did not know, and what he only realized 3 days later, when the unseasonal Sirocco wind broke and his chronic sinus pressure lifted, was that his hand had never lost its skill. The marble was no harder than it had always been. His body was simply processing an invisible exhaustion, a silent biological recalibration, while his anxious mind desperately tried to write a tragedy to explain why the world felt heavy. When he finally returned to the block days later with a cleared head, he didn't try to fix the gouge. He carved it into a deeper shadow, and the sculpture became greater for the wound. But for 48 hours he had walked through hell, not because his art had failed him, but because he had surrendered his interpretation to the lowest, most fearful bidder within his own skull. To master the heavy day, one must learn the art of the pattern interruption. When the unseen drain settles over you, when conversations feel thin, tasks feel mountainous, and your mind begins its insidious whisper that something fundamental within you is broken, you must execute a deliberate cognitive arrest. Do not argue with the thoughts. Do not attempt to fix your life, analyze your career, or audit your psychological health on a day when your internal barometer is reading low. You must separate the instrument from the weather. Take a physical step back from the machinery of your day. Pause. Look at the heaviness not as an indictment of your character or a permanent loss of your direction, but as a simple, unromantic atmospheric condition. Remind yourself, I am feeling heavy, but I am not broken. The machine is running through a storm, it is not crashing into the earth. By interrupting the downward spiral here before the mind can weave its elaborate, destructive tapestries of self-doubt, you reclaim your sovereignty. You stop the bleeding before the wound is even named. Yet, arresting the descent is only the first movement of the symphony. Once the mind is paused, a far more dangerous mechanism takes over in the quiet hours of reflection. For when the sun goes down and the room grows dark, the unexamined mind does not merely rest. It actively distorts the events of the day, turning ordinary shadows into towering monsters. How does the mind achieve this alchemy of self-deception? And how do we seize control of our internal dialogue before it rewrites our very identity? The blue hour of dusk settles over the city with a quiet velvet finality. Inside a dimly lit study, a solitary man sits motionless before a cold hearth, watching the last embers fade into a coat of gray ash. To an outside spectator, he appears entirely serene, a figure carved from marble, resting after the labor of a long week. But beneath this placid exterior, a fierce, silent alchemy is taking place. The events of the day have long since concluded. The emails have stopped arriving. The phone has fallen silent. The doors are bolted against the outside world. Yet, the man is not at peace. His mind, refusing the sanctuary of stillness, reaches back across the hours like an archaeological excavator unearthing ruins that were never meant to see the light of day. He revisits a routine conversation with a business associate, a brief passing exchange where his proposal was met with a polite, non-committal nod. In real time, the interaction had lasted barely 30 seconds, carrying no emotional weight, leaving no visible shrapnel. But in the quiet theater of the evening mind, that nod is magnified into a sweeping indictment. The mind takes the neutral canvas of reality and begins to paint furiously over it. Why did he look away just then? The mind whispers, turning a simple shift in posture into a calculated dismissal. Why was my voice trembling when I spoke? It is because they see through me. They know I am losing my grip. The human consciousness cannot abide a vacuum of neutrality. Left unattended in the silence, it resembles a frantic archivist working in a collapsing library, desperately trying to categorize every floating scrap of paper before the roof caves in. What began as a neutral afternoon, neither a triumph nor a disaster, simply a sequence of ordinary occurrences, is systematically dismantled, reassembled, and weaponized. The man watches this internal theater unfold, unaware that he is both the torturer and the victim. He believes he is simply processing the day, exercising a healthy dose of self-reflection. But what he is actually doing is feeding raw material into an insatiable internal mill that grinds fine sand out of solid rock, transforming a thoroughly ordinary Tuesday into a quiet, crushing personal defeat. Why does the human intellect possess this bizarre, almost suicidal compulsion to transform neutral reality into hostile fiction? Why are we structurally incapable of experiencing an event and letting it remain what it is? To unravel this, we must deploy recursive thinking. We must ask why the brain rejects raw occurrence in favor of constructed narrative, and then interrogate how this cognitive sleight of hand surreptitiously rewrites our entire identity. At the core of the psychological architecture lies a profound survival mechanism hijacked by modern anxieties. Primitive man needed to convert environmental stimuli into immediate meaning to stay alive. A rustle in the bushes was never just a rustle, it was a predator. The brain evolved as an organ of hyperassociation, hardwired to connect dots, spot patterns, and predict danger before it materialized. Why does this survival engine turn inward today? Because in the absence of physical predators, the modern ego becomes its own saboteur. When a man faces a social ambiguity, a lukewarm professional response, or a day lacking in tangible victory, his ancestral pattern recognition software panics. It looks at the ambiguity and demands a verdict. How does the mind construct this verdict? It operates through an invisible, lightning-fast collapse of two entirely different categories: event and meaning. An event is what occurs in physical reality, a cold fact, an objective data point stripped of emotion. Someone crossed the room, a project was delayed, a sentence was left unfinished. Meaning is the interpretive gloss we smear over that data point, a subjective fiction born of our insecurities, our fatigue, and our secret dreads. Most human beings live their entire lives under the catastrophic illusion that event and meaning are the exact same thing. When a man experiences a misaligned moment, his brain compresses the space between what happened and what it signifies into 0 seconds. He does not say, "An event occurred, and now I am choosing to assign a dark narrative to it." Instead, his nervous system reacts as though the dark narrative is an immutable law of physics. A single day that felt clumsy becomes more than a day. It hardens into evidence. Evidence that my competence is eroding. Evidence that my direction has been compromised. Evidence that I am an imposter. Philosophically, this is the ultimate trap of the unexamined ego. We mistake our own spontaneous interpretations for objective truth. We build entire prisons out of shadows, lock ourselves inside them, and then throw away the key, genuinely believing that the universe built the walls around us. Consider the profound psychological discipline of Abraham Lincoln during the darkest winters of the American Civil War. In the autumn of 1862, the Union Army had suffered a catastrophic series of defeats. The Potomac ran red with the blood of young men. Political enemies in Washington circled like vultures. The foreign press mocked the Democratic experiment as a failed enterprise. And even members of Lincoln's own cabinet whispered behind his back that he lacked the spine and intellect for the crisis. By all objective measures, the days were heavy, chaotic, and relentlessly hostile. Lesser men would have gazed upon the carnage of the battlefield and the treachery of their allies, and drawn an immediate fatalistic conclusion. We are doomed. I am inadequate. The cause is lost. Yet Lincoln possessed an extraordinary, almost superhuman capacity to separate the raw event of military failure from the permanent meaning of his destiny. On a particularly grueling evening, after receiving dispatches detailing thousands of casualties at Antietam and facing a barrage of condemnation from his generals, Lincoln sat alone in his second-floor office at the Executive Mansion. A visitor found him staring intently out the window into the dark Pennsylvania Avenue. "Mr. President," the visitor asked cautiously, "how can you bear the weight of these continuous reverses? Surely they prove that our strategy is bankrupt and our leadership is failing." Lincoln turned slowly, his deep-set eyes reflecting the dim candlelight. He did not deny the horror of the dispatches. He did not minimize the blood spilled on the fields. But he made a vital, razor-sharp distinction. "The battle was lost today," Lincoln said quietly, his voice steady despite the immense fatigue etched into his skin. "The reports are true. The blood is real. But a lost field is an event, sir. It is not a prophecy. The enemy measures our survival by our losses. I measure our purpose by our resolve. If I allowed today's casualty list to define tomorrow's capability, the war is already over before the sun rises. We do not surrender the future because the present is stormy." Lincoln refused to let the raw data of a terrible day curdle into permanent self-doubt. He looked at the chaos, cataloged the tactical failure, and then built an unshakable wall between what happened and what he chose it to mean. While his critics drowned in the emotional swamp of their own interpretations, Lincoln used his mind as an instrument of navigation rather than a torture chamber. That rigorous discipline of interpretation is precisely what preserved the Union when any other man would have collapsed under the invisible weight of his own thoughts. To break free from the trap of interpretation, you must master the art of the cognitive wedge. When you find yourself sitting in the quiet hours, replaying a difficult moment, magnifying a flaw, or turning a neutral day into an existential crisis, you must introduce a deliberate interruption into the machinery of your mind. You must deploy a mental affirmation that acts as a circuit breaker for emotional self-destruction. I do not judge my direction by a single day. Speak this truth silently to yourself whenever the mind attempts to knit a tragedy out of ordinary friction. This simple statement creates an immense life-saving chasm between your experience and your identity. It reminds you that an event is just a visitor passing through the house. It does not own the deed to the property. As this awareness takes root, you will notice a radical transformation in your internal landscape. You will watch your mind race toward a catastrophic conclusion. And instead of leaping into the abyss with it, you will simply step back and observe the machinery at work. You will realize that discomfort does not automatically mean danger, and a misaligned moment does not mean a lost life. Yet, mastering the moment of interpretation is only the battle's outer wall. Beyond the conscious interpretation of events lies an even more insidious realm, the looping, automated echoes of the internal monologue that replay in the deep chambers of memory long after the lights have gone out. How do these mental echoes shape our confidence? And how do we seize control of our internal dialogue before it rewrites our very character? The hour is late, and the house has descended into a cathedral-like silence. The rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall measures out the slow, indifferent passage of time. In the dim light of a solitary reading lamp, a man sits at his desk, staring blankly at a blank sheet of paper or a darkened computer screen. The physical labor of the day is long finished, yet his mind is running a relentless, high-speed marathon through an invisible stadium. To any onlooker, he is entirely motionless, a silhouette cut from shadow and amber light. But inside his skull, a phantom choir is singing a dirge. It is the echo chamber of the unguided internal monologue. The mind, freed from the immediate demands of external survival, seizes upon the day's minor frictions and begins to loop them with terrifying fidelity. A misplaced word spoken during a morning briefing is replayed over and over, each iteration slightly more exaggerated than the last. A moment of hesitation before a decision is magnified into an indictment of his entire professional competence. The man listens to this internal broadcast as though tuning into a live feed of objective reality. He does not realize that the broadcast is heavily edited, scored with dramatic, tragic music, and projected onto a screen distorted by fatigue. The loop accelerates. The voice in his head adopts a cold, judicial tone, cross-examining his choices, cataloging his failures, and whispering insidious generalizations. You are losing your edge. You hesitated today. You always falter when the pressure mounts. The air in the room feels suddenly thin, heavy with the phantom weight of a courtroom trial where he is simultaneously the accused, the prosecutor, and the doomed defendant. He believes he is simply reflecting, being ruthlessly honest with himself. But what is truly happening is far more destructive. He is passively surrendering the steering wheel of his consciousness to an automated, malfunctioning feedback loop that feeds exclusively on his deepest insecurities. Why does the human mind, when left to its own devices in the quiet hours, consistently gravitate towards self-flagellation rather than objective assessment? Why does memory act less like a reliable archive and more like a forge of self-doubt? To dismantle this psychological phenomenon, we must apply recursive thinking. We must ask why memory is inherently wired to prioritize emotional wounds over neutral truths, and then investigate how unchecked internal dialogue rewrites our neurological baseline. At the evolutionary root, the brain is fundamentally designed for threat mitigation, not emotional comfort. A negative memory carries a survival utility that a positive memory lacks. Remembering where the predator lurked kept our ancestors alive, whereas remembering a pleasant sunset did not. Why does this survival mechanism betray us in modern life? Because the modern environment presents no physical tigers, the brain redirects its ancient threat detection software inward. It treats a social awkwardness, a delayed project, or a momentary drop in energy with the exact same neurochemical alarm bells that our ancestors reserved for charging beasts. How does this manifest in our nightly reflection? When memory retrieves an event from the day, it does not retrieve it in pristine, high-definition neutrality. It retrieves it through the emotional filter of how we felt at our lowest ebb. If a man felt insecure at 2:00 p.m., his memory of a 10:00 a.m. conversation will be retroactively contaminated by that 2:00 p.m. insecurity. The mind paints the past with the pigments of the present. Philosophically, this exposes a profound flaw in our relationship with thinking. We suffer from the deep-seated illusion of cognitive infallibility, the subconscious belief that if I thought it, it must be true. When a thought arises, I am failing, we treat it as a weather report from reality rather than what it actually is. A transient, neurochemical weather artifact generated by a fatigued organ. Left without guidance, the mind naturally follows the path of least resistance, which is always the path of highest emotional charge. It seeks out drama, danger, and defeat, because those narratives feel potent, urgent, and familiar. And with every repetition of that internal monologue, synaptic pathways are reinforced. The neural highway of self-doubt becomes wider, smoother, and infinitely faster, until automated self-sabotage feels like clear, objective truth. Consider the legendary discipline of military strategist General Henri de La Tour operating during a grueling campaign across the rain-soaked valleys of Central Europe. The campaign had been a mess of logistics failures, uncooperative terrain, and retreating enemy forces that slipped through the mist like ghosts. By the time the army pitched camp for the night under a relentless downpour, the officers were exhausted, soaked to the bone, and nursing a profound sense of failure. Inside the Grand Command tent, illuminated by sputtering tallow candles, General de La Tour sat alone over a map covered in ink-stained operational reports. His junior officers huddled near the brazier, openly indulging in the dark art of unguided rumination. "We lost the high ground at the ridge," one officer muttered, his voice trembling with fatigue. "We misjudged their cavalry speed. The entire flank is compromised because of my miscalculation. We are undone." Another officer chimed in, compounding the gloom. "The men are losing faith. We've been marching in circles for 3 weeks. I am entirely unsuited for this command. The atmosphere in the tent thickened with despair, a toxic fog generated by tired minds replaying the day's setbacks through a lens of total catastrophe. General de la Tour looked up from his map. He did not scold them, nor did he offer cheap, hollow optimism. Instead, he stood, walked over to the brazier, and picked up a heavy iron poker. With deliberate, measured movements, he stirred the glowing coals until the sparks danced up into the darkness of the tent. "Gentlemen," the general said, his voice cutting through the whining wind outside with the authority of a church bell, "you are confusing an audit with an execution." He pointed the iron poker at the maps. "The high ground was lost. That is a tactical fact. The enemy cavalry moved faster than anticipated. That is an operational variable. These are data points on a map. They are not prophecies of our destruction. But you," he looked directly at his weeping commanders, "you are sitting here replaying the mud and the mist through the eyes of terrified children. You are taking a single difficult day and forging a chain out of it to bind your own hands for tomorrow." The general instituted a strict discipline for the remainder of the campaign. No officer was permitted to review the day's events without a structural framework. They were required to separate what happened from what they feared it meant. They audited their mistakes with surgical coldness, stripped of all emotional dramatics, and then they sealed the ledgers for the night. By refusing to let his command staff indulge in unguided, destructive internal monologues, de la Tour preserved their operational clarity. While opposing armies tore themselves apart from the inside out through psychological demoralization, his forces remained steady, precise, and unbreakable, not because they faced fewer difficulties, but because their general mastered the gatekeeper of the mind. To break the tyranny of the unguided internal monologue, you must transform your relationship with your own thoughts. You must transition from being a passive passenger in the theater of your mind to becoming its stern, discerning director. When the evening settles and your mind begins its familiar, insidious drift toward replaying what went wrong, you must implement a strict cognitive protocol. Do not let reflection run wild without a blueprint. Introduce an absolute authority over your internal dialogue by anchoring yourself in a powerful mental affirmation. I direct my thoughts. I do not let them direct me. Whenever the mind attempts to loop a failure, magnify an awkwardness, or whisper a defeatist narrative, interrupt it instantly with this truth. Force your internal monologue to operate under structure by asking 3 precise, uncompromising questions. What is actually useful here? Extract the objective data. Discard the emotional static. What requires correction? Identify the specific operational fix, if any. What must be released? Let go of the toxic narrative and the bruised ego. These 3 questions act as a firewall against distortion. They replace passive, destructive rumination with active, sovereign mastery. As you practice this discipline, the chaotic storm within your skull will begin to subside. You will notice that memories lose their sting when they are stripped of emotional exaggeration. You will walk through the world with a profound, unshakable composure, knowing that your mind is no longer a trapdoor dropping you into despair, but an instrument serving your highest intent. Yet, even when the internal monologue is mastered, there remains a deeper, more profound mystery in the rhythm of human effort. The strange days when you walk the path with pure intention, yet the universe itself seems to push back against your every step. Why do some days feel like walking through quicksand even when your heart is pure and your mind is clear? Is resistance always an enemy, or is it something far more sacred? There is a strange, phantom resistance that occasionally overtakes a man who knows precisely where he is going. He rises with the sun, his intent clear, his preparations meticulous, his tools sharpened to a razor's edge. He steps onto the familiar road of his vocation, or his daily discipline, expecting the world to meet his momentum with its customary compliance. Yet, from the very first stride, the landscape feels subtly wrong. It is akin to a master violinist picking up his instrument on a damp evening, only to find that the wood has swollen, the strings have lost their tension, and every note emerges slightly choked and rebellious. Conversations with trusted colleagues feel distant and brittle, like dry leaves crunching underfoot. Decisions that usually slide effortlessly into place now require an agonizing Herculean exertion of will. The very air seems to thicken with an invisible viscosity, turning a routine morning into a grueling march through knee-deep mud. To an outside observer, nothing is visibly broken. The man is still moving forward, his shoes are still striking the pavement, but internally, the rhythm has fractured. Every action produces a dull, hollow thud rather than the crisp resonance of progress. The immediate temptation is to name this friction as an enemy, to conclude that the road is blocked, the direction is flawed, or the endeavor is doomed. Yet, behind this frustrating wall of resistance, something far more mysterious is occurring. The path is not fighting him to destroy his momentum. It is resisting him because his current velocity is out of alignment with the deeper contours of reality. The universe, in its infinite architectural wisdom, is applying pressure to force a correction that the conscious mind is too blind to initiate on its own. Why does the modern mind reflexively interpret every form of friction as a catastrophic failure? Why are we culturally conditioned to believe that smooth, linear progress is the only valid metric of alignment? To decode this paradox, we must deploy recursive thinking. We must ask why we equate ease with righteousness, and then investigate how structural resistance serves as a hidden engine of evolution rather than a marker of defeat. At the bedrock of our psychological programming lies a naive, comforting teleology, the belief that if an action is correct, the path must naturally open before it like the parting of the Red Sea. We inherit a cultural mythology that values speed, scalability, and frictionless execution above all else. When the world resists our efforts, when doors stick, projects stall, or connections fail, our fragile egos immediately sound the alarm bells of rejection. Why does the ego react with such terror to resistance? Because the ego defines its worth entirely through external validation and momentum. It measures success by how fast the scenery is blurring past. How does this psychological blind spot distort our perception of reality? It leads us to mistake calibration for cancellation. When a ship's captain encounters a sudden, unyielding cross-current, he does not curse the water and assume his destination has vanished from the map. He recognizes that the current is data. He adjusts his rudder, reads the hidden pressures of the deep, and lets the water steer him toward a truer course. Philosophically, this reveals a profound truth about human development. Growth does not happen in the smooth spaces, it happens in the friction. The physical universe operates through resistance. A seed does not break through the hard, unyielding earth because the soil is gentle and welcoming. It breaks through because it matches the oppressive weight of the dirt with an internal, upward fury of life. Similarly, when a man experiences a misaligned day where his efforts meet stubborn resistance, he is not necessarily failing. He is being squeezed through a mold that forces him to shed superficial methods, inefficient habits, and blind assumptions. The resistance is the chisel shaping the marble of his character. What feels like an obstacle blocking his path is often the path itself, refusing to let him pass until he has transformed enough to survive where he is going. Consider the early, turbulent industrial experiments of Henry Ford during the twilight years of the 19th century. Long before the assembly lines of Detroit hummed with unstoppable precision, Ford was a wandering mechanic obsessed with the internal combustion engine. In his early ventures, everything seemed cursed by profound, relentless misalignment. His first major company, the Detroit Automobile Company, collapsed in spectacular failure. Investors grew cold. Backers withdrew their capital. The vehicles he designed were mocked by the established carriage, makers as loud, unreliable toys that frightened horses and choked the city streets with smoke. By all conventional metrics of the era, those difficult years were a disaster. Every door he pushed open slammed shut in his face. Every partnership fractured under the weight of financial strain. A lesser man would have looked at the closed doors, diagnosed the resistance as absolute proof of inadequacy, and retreated to the safe, predictable life of a master machinist. Yet Ford viewed the friction entirely differently. He did not see the collapsed company as a sign that he should abandon the automobile. He saw it as an unyielding teacher, exposing the fatal flaws in his engineering philosophy. During the long, desolate months between ventures, sitting in a drafty workshop with dwindling funds, Ford did not lament his lack of progress. Instead, he studied the resistance. He realized that trying to build luxury cars for the wealthy elite was a misaligned endeavor. It went against the grain of his true genius, which was mass production and universal utility. The market resistance he faced was not telling him to stop. It was violently redirecting him toward the Model T. When he finally launched his third enterprise, the Ford Motor Company, it was built entirely upon the lessons forged in those years of failure. The resistance had stripped away his ego, refined his design, and aligned his ambition with the actual needs of humanity. The friction had not destroyed him, it had calibrated him. To master the art of the misaligned day, you must fundamentally alter your posture toward difficulty. When you step into a day where nothing flows, where conversations snag and efforts curdle, do not retreat into frustration and do not push forward with blind brute force ignorance. Pause. Step back from the machinery of your ambition and ask the transformative question, what is this resistance trying to teach me? Adopt the internal affirmation that bridges the gap between frustration and evolution. Even this day carries something that strengthens me. When you consciously look for the lesson hidden inside the friction, the nature of the day changes entirely. What felt like an annoying barrier transforms into a diagnostic instrument. You stop fighting the current and begin reading its direction. You ask yourself, what assumptions am I clinging to? Where is my approach rigid? What part of my character needs to be tempered by this delay? By extracting value from disruption, you turn wasted energy into raw fuel. You realize that a day of resistance is not a day lost. It is a day spent sharpening the blade in the dark, so that the light of tomorrow finds it ready to cut cleanly. Yet, once the resistance is understood and the calibration is complete, the man is left standing at a delicate threshold. He has survived the heavy day, decoded the interpretation, mastered his internal monologue, and learned the secret of resistance. But now he faces the aftermath, the lingering static, the quiet tremor of an unsettled nervous system that refuses to settle simply because the sun has set. How does a man transition from surviving the chaos of the day to reclaiming his unshakable inner center? What is the precise psychological architecture of the reset? The evening arrives not with a sudden crash of darkness, but with the slow, violet cooling of a room after a long fire has burned down to its coals. The day's labors are finished, the emails have ceased their relentless chirping, and the world outside the window is wrapping itself in the velvet shroud of night. Yet, within the quiet confines of the room, a man stands motionless, staring at his open hands as though they belong to a stranger. Externally, the storm has passed. The difficult conversations were concluded, the minor crises were managed, the fires were put out, but internally the machinery of his being is still vibrating at a high erratic frequency. It is the residual tremor, that phantom hum of static electricity that lingers in the nervous system long after the lightning has struck. His jaw is tight, his breathing is shallow, trapped high in the chest. A low-grade, nameless frustration hums just beneath the surface of his skin. A persistent reminder of a day that refused to bend to his will. The immediate, instinctive urge is to rush forward into tomorrow. The conditioned mind whispers that the only cure for a turbulent day is aggressive preparation for the next. To draft more lists, map out fresh strategies, redouble efforts, and force the world into submission through sheer volume of activity. He wants to plunge back into motion, desperate to outrun the phantom static clinging to his heels. Yet, to move forward from this fractured state is to build a house upon quicksand. He stands at a critical, silent crossroads. He can either drag the unmanaged turbulence of today straight into the architecture of tomorrow, or he can execute the most difficult, sacred maneuver available to man, the deliberate, uncompromising return to center. Why does the modern man find it so agonizingly difficult to simply stop and restore his internal equilibrium? Why is our first instinct always to accelerate when we are already flying off the rails? To dissect this compulsion, we must apply recursive thinking. We must ask why action becomes an addiction during times of distress, and then investigate how movement without balance guarantees the perpetuation of our suffering. At the psychological core of this behavior lies a profound terror of stillness. For most of our lives, we have been conditioned to equate motion with safety and productivity with worth. When a day goes wrong and leaves us internally shattered, stillness feels dangerous. In the quiet, the unresolved tensions, the quiet humiliations, and the unspoken doubts come out of the shadows to demand an audience. Why do we run from this quiet? Because the ego fears that if it stops moving, it will have to face its own fracture. It believes that speed is a shield against vulnerability. How does this manifest in our daily execution? When a man acts from a state of internal imbalance, his actions lose their precision. He is no longer operating with sovereign intent. He is thrashing. Every decision he makes is a reactionary compensation for the chaos of the hours before. He sends the sharp email, he pushes the exhausted team, he forces the reluctant deal, not because the moment requires it, but because his nervous system is screaming for control. Philosophically, this is the fundamental error of the frantic builder. The outcome of an action is governed less by the effort applied than by the internal condition from which it is launched. If you shoot an arrow from a bow that is warped and shaking in your hands, no amount of aerodynamic calculation will save the shot. The arrow will fly crooked because the launcher was unstable. Yet, humanity spends 99% of its energy modifying the arrow while completely ignoring the shaking hands of the archer. True power does not reside in doing more. It resides in becoming stable. Before a man can claim mastery over his external circumstances, he must master the art of the inner reset. Consider the ancient traditions of master archers in the high valleys of feudal Japan, where archery was practiced not merely as a mechanism of war, but as a rigorous moving meditation on the state of the soul. During a period of bitter civil skirmishes, a renowned archer named Kenzo was tasked with defending a mountain pass against an advancing vanguard. The days leading up to the battle had been plagued by relentless rain, freezing mud, and treacherous winds that mocked every calculation of trajectory and windage. On the eve of the engagement, Kenzo stood on the ridge, his bow unstrung, his fingers stiff from the cold. His younger students were frantic. They ran back and forth across the encampment, oiling their strings, checking their quivers, arguing bitterly over tactics, and fanning the flames of their collective anxiety through endless panicked chatter. They were moving at a furious pace, desperate to outrun the rising tide of fear. Kenzo did not join them. He walked away from the frantic preparations, found a flat stone sheltered beneath a granite overhang, and sat down in absolute stillness. He closed his eyes. He did not touch his bow. He did not review the enemy's numbers. He simply sat, breathing into his hurrah the deep center of gravity in the lower abdomen, letting the chaotic static of the day drain out of his limbs like dark water sinking into dry earth. One of his anxious students approached him, breathless and agitated. "Master, the enemy approaches by dawn. The winds are unpredictable, and our hands are shaking with cold. Why do you sit in inaction? We must prepare. We must check the bows." Kenzo opened his eyes slowly. There was no panic in his gaze, only the vast, unruffled depth of a deep mountain lake. "If I string the bow while my hands are trembling," Kenzo spoke with quiet gravity, "the arrow will know my terror before it ever leaves the wood. A shaking hand cannot command a true flight. Go back to your bow, student, and sit until the shaking stops. For an arrow shot from chaos will always find disaster, no matter how sharp the point." Kenzo remained in stillness for hours, long after the students had exhausted themselves into silence. When dawn broke, pale and freezing over the mountain pass, Kenzo stepped forward. His movements were liquid, economical, and utterly serene. When he drew his bow, his breathing was as steady as the stone beneath his feet. His arrows flew with supernatural precision, not because the wind had died down or the conditions had improved, but because the archer had anchored his center before he loosed his power. To embody this truth today, you must master the sacred art of the inner reset. When the day ends in friction and your nervous system hums with the residual static of frustration, you must refuse the temptation to push forward into frantic activity. Step back. Disconnect from the machinery of your output. Find a quiet space, sit with your spine straight, and anchor yourself in the foundational affirmation, "I return to my center, and from there, I move again." Observe your internal condition without judgment. Notice where the tension clings in the jaw, the shoulders, the tightness of the breath. Do not fight the tension. Simply breathe into it and allow your nervous system to settle, like silt sinking to the bottom of an undisturbed pond. In that deliberate stillness, clarity returns not through forced intellectual effort, but through the natural absence of noise. You realize that balance is not something you chase. It is something you uncover by simply stopping long enough for the dust to settle. If this practice of the inner reset resonates with your pursuit of enduring strength, take a moment now to hit like and subscribe. Support this channel as we continue building a sanctuary for disciplined, sovereign minds. When you master the reset, you ensure that whatever you build tomorrow will be erected upon a foundation of unshakable stability rather than frantic desperation. You stop carrying yesterday's garbage into today's pristine dawn. Yet, as the inner balance is restored and the static fades, a deeper, more profound question rises from the depths of self-reflection. What happens to the fundamental strength of a man when the trials are so relentless that he feels he has lost his edge entirely? When he looks in the mirror of his soul and sees only a ghost of his former capability? There is a chilling phantom whisper that occasionally echoes through the quiet corridors of a man's mind after a prolonged season of friction and defeat. It is the insidious suggestion that he has permanently lost his edge, that the vigor, clarity, and resilience he once possessed have not merely been taxed but evaporated into the ether. He stands before the mirror of his own self-assessment during a quiet, gray morning, searching the contours of his reflection for signs of the formidable force he used to be. The eyes looking back appear tired. The posture carries a slight unfamiliar stoop. The inner fire feels dampened down to a cold gray ash. The events of recent weeks have been relentlessly taxing a string of unyielding obstacles, misaligned days, and compounding frustrations that tested every fiber of his endurance. And now, looking at the hollowed-out feeling in his chest, his mind draws a devastating, false conclusion. This is not fatigue. This is erosion. I am diminished. The strength that carried me through my youth and my early victories is gone, and what remains is a lesser version of the man I used to be. To an outside observer, his competence remains entirely intact. He still performs his duties with respectable precision. He still meets his obligations. He still walks through the world with a semblance of his old authority. Yet internally, he feels like an imposter inhabiting a shell of former glory. He moves with a quiet, pervasive hesitation, terrified that the next heavy day will expose the hollow core within him, proving once and for all that his capacity has reached its absolute expiration date. Why does the human psyche so readily confuse a temporary depletion of neurochemical energy with a permanent structural collapse of character strength? Why do we measure the depth of our inner reservoir by the dry dust on the surface? To decode this psychological delusion, we must apply recursive thinking. We must ask why emotional exhaustion masquerades so convincingly as identity loss, and then investigate how the separation of transient feeling from enduring fact forms the bedrock of true mastery. At the root of this error lies a profound neurological illusion, the conflation of state with trait. A state is temporary, fluctuating, and environmentally dependent. It is how you feel at 4:00 p.m. on a Tuesday after a bad night's sleep, a skipped meal, and 3 consecutive hours of difficult negotiations. It is subject to blood sugar, barometric pressure, cortisol spikes, and the slow drain of daily friction. A trait, by contrast, is enduring, structural, and deeply embedded. It is who you are at your core, the hard-won discipline, the accumulated resilience, the moral architecture you have spent decades constructing. Why does the stressed mind collapse these two entirely distinct categories into one? Because when a man is deep within the fog of exhaustion, his nervous system hijacks his perception. The brain, operating under a primitive survival bias, treats the immediate sensation of weakness as an objective, permanent reality. How does this cognitive trick manifest in daily life? When a man feels weak, his mind immediately concludes, "I am weak." When he feels uninspired, his mind declares, "My talent has vanished." He mistakes the weather for the mountain. He looks at a cloud-shrouded peak and assumes the mountain itself has dissolved into nothingness. Philosophically, this reveals a profound truth about human power. A man may not feel strong and yet remain profoundly strong. Strength is not an emotional performance, it is an abiding structural reality. A diamond buried under tons of heavy, suffocating clay does not lose its molecular integrity just because it cannot feel the sun. Its brilliance is not dependent on its immediate comfort. Yet, humanity judges its own worth by the weather in the valley, completely forgetting the unyielding granite of the peaks within. Consider the legendary endurance trials of ancient Greek couriers and the modern equivalents found in extreme long-distance runners who push their physical and psychological limits across brutal alpine terrain. During a high-altitude endurance race through the rugged, wind-scoured trails of the Pindus Mountains, a seasoned veteran runner named Nikos experienced what endurance athletes call hitting the wall. For 20 hours, he had climbed jagged ascents and navigated treacherous shale fields. By dawn of the second day, his body was a cathedral of raw pain. Every muscle fiber screamed in protest. His lungs felt lined with glass. His mind dissolved into a dull, hallucinatory fog. At a particularly steep incline, Nikos collapsed to his knees beside a boulder. Looking up at the remaining miles of vertical ascent, a wave of profound, crushing despair washed over him. His body felt completely hollowed out. The strength that had powered him through marathons and mountain passes for 2 decades felt like a distant, romantic myth from another lifetime. The internal voice screamed at him with absolute conviction. "You are done. Your legs are shot. Your heart cannot sustain this. You are too old, too broken, too weak to finish." A lesser competitor, listening to the absolute authority of that exhausted feeling, would have unzipped his vest, accepted defeat, and waited for the support vehicle. Nikos closed his eyes, his chest heaving, his body trembling with violent fatigue. Yet, deep beneath the frantic panic of his surface nervous system, Nikos possessed a sacred discipline born of long experience. He recognized the voice in his head for what it was. Not a statement of fact, but a biological smoke alarm triggered by systemic glycogen depletion. He did not argue with the pain. He did not try to force a burst of artificial enthusiasm. He simply spoke a quiet, foundational truth to himself in the silence of his soul. "My body is empty, but my capacity is untouched. I do not need to feel strong to take the next step." Nikos did not jump up with a roar of triumph. He simply stood, slowly and mechanically, and placed one foot in front of the other. He moved at a glacial, agonizing pace, ignoring the screams of his nervous system. And as he crossed the high pass, something miraculous occurred. The dead zone gave way. His secondary energy reserves kicked in. His rhythm returned. His strength rose up from the deep bedrock of his conditioning, proving that his power had never vanished. It had merely been obscured by a temporary curtain of exhaustion. He finished the race not because he felt invincible, but because he understood that strength persists silently beneath the noise of temporary weakness. To embody this truth today, you must refuse to judge your capacity by your comfort. When you wake with a heavy spirit, when the residue of a difficult week weighs upon your shoulders and your mind whispers that you have lost your edge, you must deploy an unshakable cognitive anchor. My strength remains, even when I do not feel it. Separate your transient feelings from your permanent character. Acknowledge the fatigue without bowing to it. Understand that feeling depleted is simply the body's natural signal to rest, not an existential verdict on your capability. When you stop panicking over the sensation of weakness, the panic itself dissolves. You realize that you do not need to manufacture artificial motivation or force a heroic performance. You simply need to trust the deep, unyielding reservoir of discipline you have built over a lifetime. When you master this distinction, you walk through the world with a quiet, impenetrable dignity. You no longer fear bad days, low energy, or difficult seasons, because you know they are merely passing weather over a mountain that cannot be moved. Yet, once the permanence of strength is secured, a vital question remains. How do we actively polish the lens through which we view our reality? How do we transform the ordinary, flawed glass of our daily perception into an instrument of profound clarity? There is a subtle, almost imperceptible smudge that occasionally forms upon the spectacles of human perception, a microscopic film of frustration, fatigue, and unaddressed disappointment. A man steps out into his morning, his environment entirely unchanged, the physical architecture of his life identical to what it was a week prior, yet the entire landscape appears shrouded in a heavy, drab monotone. The sunlight streaming through his office window no longer carries warmth. It feels sharp, exposing dust motes and minor architectural flaws. The faces of his colleagues, once familiar and comforting, now wear expressions that his weary mind instantly translates as critical or indifferent. A trivial administrative delay, a signature delayed by a day, a shipment held up at a regional depot takes on the apocalyptic proportions of a structural collapse. To an outside observer looking through a clean pane of glass, his world is stable, functioning, and rich with opportunity. But to the man trapped behind his own smeared lens, reality has transformed into a bleak, hostile wasteland. He does not realize that the distortion is entirely internal. He behaves toward his environment as though the bleakness originates out there in the world, treating every shadow as an oncoming predator. He tightens his posture, sharpens his tone, and retreats behind defensive walls of cynicism, genuinely believing that he is simply being realistic about the difficult conditions of his life. Yet the universe has not altered its composition. Only the mirror of his own consciousness has cracked, bending the incoming light into grotesque, terrifying shapes. Why does the human mind stubbornly insist on treating its own subjective distortions as objective reality? Why is it so radically difficult to clean the lens of perception when the view turns dark? To dismantle this cognitive trap, we must apply recursive thinking. We must ask why perception naturally decays into cynicism under stress, and then investigate how conscious reframing acts as a powerful psychological alchemy that turns leaden events into golden insight. At the evolutionary core of perception lies a deeply ingrained bias toward threat. When resources are low and energy is depleted, the brain's survival circuits automatically dim the brightness settings of consciousness. It adopts a pessimistic filter to ensure the organism is prepared for the worst-case scenario. Why does this survival filter become a prison in modern life? Because primitive pessimism was designed for short-term physical danger, not chronic psychological navigation. When left unchecked, the brain's default negativity bias builds a permanent dome of distortion over our reality. How does the mind construct this illusion? It operates through selection and magnification. The distorted mind acts like a ruthless censor, actively screening out every piece of positive or neutral data while hyper-focusing on the single speck of imperfection. If 9 things go right in a morning and 1 minor thing goes wrong, the distorted lens blots out the 9 successes and magnifies the single failure until it occupies 100% of the visual field. Philosophically, this reveals the ultimate sovereign power available to human consciousness. Reality is not merely experienced, it is authored. Events are raw, neutral minerals delivered to the gates of the mind. Perspective is the alchemical furnace that determines whether those minerals are forged into chains of bondage or tools of liberation. A man who masters the alchemy of perspective does not deny the existence of difficult raw materials. He simply refuses to let them remain base lead. He understands that changing his vantage point changes the entire geometry of his problem, turning insurmountable walls into low steps. Consider the legendary traditions of Renaissance artisans and alchemists who spent their lifetimes working in the quiet stone cellars of European workshops, studying the transformation of base metals under intense heat and pressure. Master Giovanni was renowned across northern Italy for his ability to take discarded, oxidized bronze, scraps metal so corroded and blackened by fire that ordinary smiths threw it away as worthless slag and transform it into breathtaking, luminous ecclesiastical art. During a particularly harsh winter, a severe workshop fire destroyed a major portion of Giovanni's finished inventory, ruining months of delicate labor in a single night of ash and smoke. The financial loss was devastating, and the physical damage to his studio seemed absolute. When his apprentice arrived the next morning, weeping and coughing amidst the soot, he looked at the melted heaps of twisted metal and declared the enterprise ruined. "It is all gone, master," the apprentice cried, his voice trembling in the freezing air. "The months of work, the gold leaf, the bronze castings, all reduced to worthless slag. We are ruined." Giovanni did not weep. He walked slowly through the charred remains, his face smeared with soot, his eyes reflecting the pale morning light. He bent down, picked up a heavy, blackened lump of melted bronze that had once been a masterwork crucifix, and weighed it in his scarred palm. "Nothing is ruined, boy," Giovanni said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who looked deeper than the surface. "This fire did not destroy our material, it merely melted away our precise designs. It stripped the metal back to its primitive, unformed state. It gave us raw potential. Giovanni did not spend the winter mourning the lost inventory. Instead, he gathered the blackened slag, stoked the furnace to a higher heat than he had ever dared before, and used the impurities in the burnt metal to alloy a new, darker, infinitely stronger bronze. By spring, he had crafted a series of sculptures that far surpassed his previous work in depth, resilience, and emotional resonance. The catastrophe had not destroyed his capability. It had forced him to look through a new lens, revealing artistic possibilities that comfort and smooth success had hidden from his eyes. To embody this alchemical truth today, you must assume absolute responsibility for the clarity of your own vision. When the world looks bleak, hostile, and uncooperative, do not waste your energy trying to remodel the external universe. Instead, pause, step back, and clean your lens. Implement a deliberate reframing protocol whenever distortion threatens to cloud your judgment. I do not see the world as it is. I see the world as I am. Acknowledge that your immediate dissatisfaction is an optical artifact of your internal state, not an objective truth about your life. Force your mind to widen its aperture. Actively search out the overlooked blessings, the hidden stabilities, and the quiet triumphs that your negativity bias has filtered out of your awareness. When a difficult event occurs, do not ask, "Why is this happening to me?" Shift the alchemical question to, "How can I use this raw material to forge something stronger within myself?" When you polish your lens, the entire landscape transforms. Obstacles become teachers, heavy days become sanctuaries of calibration, and ordinary moments glow with quiet significance. You stop being a helpless victim of your own shifting moods and become the master architect of your own reality. Yet, as perception is purified and internal vision becomes crystal clear, a silent danger emerges on the horizon, not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow, imperceptible erosion that threatens to pull a man off his true path over time. How do men drift away from their deepest purpose without ever experiencing a single dramatic failure? What is the subtle physics of momentum loss? There is a terrifying quietness to how a man loses his life's direction. It rarely arrives with the dramatic thunderclap of a catastrophic failure, a shattered career, or an explosive betrayal. There is no sudden cliff over which he plunges into ruin, no roaring fire that reduces his ambitions to ash in a single night. Instead, the descent resembles the imperceptible movement of a massive ocean liner charting a course across a vast, glassy sea. A navigator makes a tiny, almost microscopic error, a deviation of just a single degree off course at the departure port. To an observer standing on the bridge, the ship is moving straight ahead, cutting through the water with majestic confidence. The instruments hum, the engines roar, the crew performs their duties with practiced precision. For the first few leagues, the deviation is utterly invisible. The ocean looks identical on all sides. Yet as days bleed into weeks, that single, uncorrected degree of error compounds silently in the dark. The ship does not crash. It simply drifts. While the captain believes he is steaming toward a destination of light and purpose, the silent currents carry him thousands of leagues off course, until he wakes one morning to find his vessel stranded upon an unmapped, desolate shore of which he never dreamed. So it is with human existence. A man does not wake up one morning and decide to abandon his deepest values, his highest ambitions, or his moral integrity. He drifts away through a series of micro-concessions. He misinterprets a difficult day, accepts a minor distortion in his thinking, hesitates for a moment when conviction was required, and allows a tiny compromise to slip unchallenged into his routine. Outwardly, he appears completely stable. He still goes to work. He still fulfills his social roles. He still smiles at the appropriate intervals. But beneath that polished surface, the invisible current of drift has taken hold. He is moving with immense velocity, yet he is heading nowhere, or worse, heading precisely where he never intended to go. Why does human consciousness possess such a dangerous susceptibility to gradual drift? Why do we fail to notice the slow, eroding decay of our trajectory until we are miles away from our true path? To dissect this phenomenon, we must apply recursive thinking. We must ask why the human brain ignores microscopic deviations in behavior, and then investigate how uncorrected micro-compromises compound into massive life alterations over time. At the evolutionary root, the human mind is optimized for immediate sensory feedback, not long-term geometrical projection. When primitive man walked through the wilderness, his survival depended on reacting to what was directly in front of him: a branch snapping, a predator lunging, a fruit hanging low. He was never wired to calculate the cumulative trajectory of 1,000 tiny, unmeasured choices spread across decades. Why does this lack of macrovision sabotage us today? Because modern life is built on invisible compounding. Every choice, no matter how insignificant it feels in the moment, is an investment in a specific trajectory. How does the cycle of drift exploit this neurological blind spot? It preys upon the illusion of harmlessness. When a man misses his morning discipline by 10 minutes, when he lets a negative interpretation pass without challenge, or when he avoids a difficult conversation out of temporary cowardice, his brain registers the action as zero cost. It is only today, the mind whispers. It is only a minor deviation. It means nothing. The mind treats each compromise as a discrete, isolated event with zero historical memory. But reality does not operate in isolation. Reality is a strict accountant that records every single micro-deviation. Philosophically, this reveals the core danger of unexamined living. You do not sink to the level of your ambitions. You fall to the level of your systems. A man who lacks a mechanism for continuous course correction does not stand still when storms hit. He drifts. Without a compass that is constantly checked against true north, he mistakes motion for progress, busyness for purpose, and distance from his destination for arrival. Consider the historical records of the great transoceanic voyages during the Age of Discovery, when seasoned captains navigated vast, featureless oceans relying solely on celestial observation and the steady hand of the helm. Captain James Vance commanded a heavily laden merchant galleon tasked with a critical diplomatic voyage across the Atlantic. The journey began in crisp autumn weather, the winds favorable, the crew disciplined and eager. For the first week, the ship sailed true, cutting clean white furrows through the deep blue swells. On the 8th night, under a heavy bank of high-altitude clouds that obscured the stars, a subtle, shifting ocean current pushed the vessel off its heading by less than half a compass point. It was a negligible variance, so slight that the helmsman felt no shift in the rudder, and the logbook recorded standard speed. When the first officer came on watch, he noticed the faint atmospheric haze. He had a choice. He could spend an hour recalibrating his instruments using dead reckoning and take corrective action immediately, or he could trust the general feel of the wind and assume they were still on track. Weary from the day's labor, he chose the path of least resistance. The wind feels right, he told himself. We will correct it at dawn. Dawn brought more clouds, and then a thick sea fog that blanketed the horizon for 3 consecutive days. During those 72 hours of zero visibility, the ship continued its forward momentum, running smoothly, crew members laughing on deck, entirely unaware of their danger. When the fog finally parted on the 4th morning, Captain Vance stepped onto the quarterdeck with his brass spyglass raised, expecting to sight the familiar cliffs of their destination port. Instead, his blood ran cold. The ship was not entering safe harbor. It was gliding perilously close to the jagged coral reefs of an uncharted, treacherous archipelago. Had they delayed their course correction by even 1 more hour, the ship would have been splintered against the rocks. The catastrophe was not caused by a sudden storm or a malicious attack. It was born entirely of a tiny, uncorrected drift that was allowed to compound in the fog while the crew slept in false security. To break the cycle of drift in your own life, you must implement a system of ruthless, uncompromising self-auditing. You cannot rely on how you feel about your direction, because drift always feels comfortable. It is the path of least resistance. Stop relying on the illusion that you are safe simply because you are moving. Pause. Look at your instruments and execute an immediate course correction by anchoring yourself in the stabilizing affirmation. I measure my life by my direction, not my motion. Establish a non-negotiable end-of-day audit. Do not let days slip by unexamined. Ask yourself the vital questions that stop drift in its tracks. Am I moving closer to my true north, or am I merely staying busy to avoid discomfort? What minor compromise did I allow today that I must correct tomorrow? Where have I let my standards quietly erode under the pressure of fatigue? By shining the bright light of awareness upon your trajectory daily, you catch deviations while they are still microscopic, turning a potential catastrophe into a simple, effortless adjustment of the helm. When you master the discipline of course correction, drift loses its power over you. You stop wandering through your life as a passenger of circumstance and become the captain of your destiny, steering a straight, unbreakable course through every storm. Yet, as the vessel of your life is steadied and guided toward its true destination, an extraordinary transformation occurs within your physical and mental presence. You no longer react to the shifting winds of the world. You anchor them. What is the ultimate state of a man who has mastered his days, his interpretations, his internal dialogue, and his trajectory? How does he move through a chaotic world with absolute, unshakable authority? There is a profound, almost unnatural stillness that surrounds a man who has mastered the internal architecture of his own mind. While the modern world operates at a frenetic, screaming pitch, panicking over shifting markets, collapsing under social pressures, and thrashing wildly at every minor inconvenience, this man moves with the serene, gravitational pull of a celestial body. Step into a crowded boardroom or a chaotic public square during a moment of sudden crisis. Voices are raised. Accusations fly like sparks from a dying fire. Panic ripples through the collective nervous system like wind sweeping across a dry wheat field. Everyone is reacting, compensating, shouting to make their terror heard above the din. Yet, in the absolute center of this swirling tempest stands a single figure. He does not raise his voice. He does not rush to fill the silence with defensive justifications. His posture is relaxed yet unyielding. His breathing is deep and rhythmic. His gaze is clear, steady, and entirely unclouded by panic. When he speaks, his words are few, weighed with gold, cutting through the emotional hysteria of the room with the quiet authority of a church bell tolling across an empty valley. To those caught in the storm, his composure appears almost miraculous, a superpower snatched from some distant realm. They look at him and feel an instinctive magnetic pull toward his gravity. They do not know the long, grueling hours of solitary discipline, the silent battles against self-doubt, or the thousands of micro-corrections that forged this state of being. They only feel the result. An unshakable, profound security emanating from a man who refuses to be swept away by the weather of his own emotions. Why is true composure so exceedingly rare in the modern epoch? Why do men mistake volume for power, reactivity for passion, and anxiety for dedication? To decode this psychological paradox, we must apply recursive thinking. We must ask why modern consciousness is addicted to frantic reactivity, and then investigate how absolute composure becomes the ultimate form of personal sovereignty and influence. At the root of our cultural neurosis lies a deep, unexamined terror of powerlessness. Because most men feel fundamentally out of control of their external circumstances, the economy, politics, relationships, fleeting trends, they attempt to overcompensate through frantic external movement. They believe that if they are shouting the loudest, moving the fastest, and reacting to every minor stimulus with high-octane drama, they are demonstrating strength. Why does this reactive posture actually destroy power? Because reactivity is the exact opposite of authority. It is absolute submission. When a man allows an external event, an insult, a delayed flight, a difficult conversation to immediately hijack his nervous system and dictate his emotional output, he has handed the steering wheel of his life over to whoever or whatever just pushed his buttons. He is a puppet dancing on the strings of his environment. How does true composure reclaim this stolen sovereignty? Composure operates on the foundational philosophical realization that between stimulus and response lies a sacred, untouchable space. In that space resides human freedom. The man who possesses true composure does not suppress his emotions or wear a mask of stoic numbness. Rather, he refuses to let his internal state be dictated by external weather. He evaluates the stimulus with cold, objective clarity, strips away the emotional static, and chooses his response with sovereign deliberation. Philosophically, this reveals the highest law of personal leadership. You cannot command others until you have mastered command over yourself. The world does not yield to those who scream at it. The world yields to the man who remains entirely unmovable while everyone else is losing their footing. Consider the historical accounts of Roman statesman and philosopher Cato the Younger, operating during the violent twilight years of the Roman Republic. Rome was descending into a vortex of populist demagoguery, violent street riots, and frantic political betrayal. The The Senate chamber, once a sanctuary of measured deliberation, had degenerated into a howling mob where senators screamed obscenities, drew daggers, and panicked at the rising power of Julius Caesar's legions. During a particularly chaotic Senate session, when armed factionalists burst into the forum and pandemonium threatened to tear the government apart instantly, panic seized the assembly. Grown men wept, hid beneath their togas, or rushed toward the exits in a stampede of raw terror. Cato did not run. He did not raise his voice or draw a weapon. He rose slowly from his carved marble bench, walked deliberately to the center of the Senate floor, and stood there in absolute, majestic stillness. His face was calm. His breathing was unhurried. He buttoned his tunic with steady fingers and simply waited. The rioters, surging forward with swords drawn, suddenly slowed to a halt as they approached him. The sheer, terrifying weight of his unshakable composure acted as an invisible physical barrier. The screaming in the chamber slowly died down, replaced by an uneasy, reverent silence. Cato looked at the armed men not with fear or defiance, but with the quiet, pitying disappointment of a teacher addressing unruly children. Without a single drop of blood being spilled, the chaotic mob lost its momentum, ground down to a standstill by the sheer gravitational pull of one man who refused to panic. Cato proved that day what history has repeatedly confirmed. A man anchored in absolute internal composure is infinitely more powerful than an army driven by panic. To embody this unshakable composure today, you must stop treating your emotional reactions as inevitable reflections of reality. When chaos surrounds you, whether in your professional environment, your family life, or your own internal thoughts, refuse the impulse to match the frantic frequency of the storm. Become the anchor. Anchor your presence in the ultimate affirmation of sovereign composure. I am the anchor in the storm. The storm passes, but I remain. When a crisis hits, practice the sacred pause. Breathe deep into your center. Let the frantic energy of everyone around you crash against your stillness like waves breaking harmlessly against a granite cliff. Do not rush to speak. Do not rush to fix. And do not allow urgency to masquerade as importance. If this embodiment of unshakable composure resonates with the quiet strength you wish to project into the world, take a moment now to hit like and subscribe. Join this community as we master the sovereign art of inner mastery. When you operate from this place of profound composure, your very presence becomes a sanctuary for others. You transform the room simply by walking into it. You stop being a victim of circumstance and become the calm eye around which the world revolves. Yet as composure becomes your second nature and mastery over self is secured, a magnificent horizon opens before you. The heavy days, the misinterpretations, the internal echoes, the resistance, the drift, and the chaos of the past are no longer enemies. They are the stepping stones of your evolution. What lies at the summit of this profound journey? What is the dawn that awaits the man who has learned the secret of the quiet correction? There is a precise, transcendent moment when a long, brutal night of the soul finally surrenders to the first pale fingers of dawn. The heavy, suffocating darkness that pressed against the windows like a physical weight begins to thin, dissolving into an exquisite, translucent violet. A man stands upon the threshold of his porch, breathing in the crisp, ozone-rich air of a newly minted morning. His chest feels open. His mind is clear and vaulted like the nave of a great cathedral. The phantom static that hummed through his nervous system for weeks has vanished entirely. To an external observer, his physical form is unchanged. He wears the same clothes, walks the same streets, and faces the same worldly responsibilities that confronted him during his darkest hours. Yet, the entire universe has been alchemized. The tasks that once felt like crushing mountains are now viewed with the clear-eyed perspective of a sovereign craftsman evaluating his tools. The minor frictions, the casual slights, and the inevitable delays of daily existence no longer pierce his armor. They break harmlessly against the unshakable citadel of his composure. He looks back across the difficult seasons, the misaligned days, the unexamined echoes, and the treacherous currents of drift not with regret, but with profound gratitude. He realizes that the heavy days were never punishments designed to break him. They were the sacred, unrelenting fires designed to forge him. The storm has cleared, leaving behind a world washed clean, shimmering with infinite potential, and entirely ready to be commanded. Why must a man pass through the crucible of misinterpretation, resistance, and internal turbulence before he can claim true mastery over his trajectory? Why is effortless, unbroken smoothness the enemy of profound evolution? To unlock this final mystery, we must apply recursive thinking. We must ask why human consciousness requires friction to wake up to its own sovereignty, and then investigate how the synthesis of past suffering creates an unbreakable, lifelong architecture of personal power. At the evolutionary and spiritual core of human existence lies a profound cosmic paradox. We do not learn from our victories, we are sculpted entirely by our collisions with reality. When a man experiences continuous, frictionless success, his awareness goes to sleep. He floats upon the surface of his life, mistaking comfortable momentum for deep character. He remains fragile, brittle, and entirely dependent on favorable external weather to maintain his equilibrium. Why does friction shatter this fragile illusion? Because a difficult day, an unaligned moment, or a season of heavy self-doubt strips away all the superficial armor of the ego. It forces a man down into the dark, foundational bedrock of his true self. How does the synthesis of these trials transform his destiny? When a man learns to stop fighting the heavy day, when he masters his internal monologue, when he treats resistance as calibration, and when he ruthlessly corrects his drift, he undergoes a silent, irreversible phase shift. He ceases to be a reactive creature of circumstance. He integrates every past failure, every moment of confusion, and every dark night into a unified philosophy of enduring personal evolution. Philosophically, he realizes that the journey was never about avoiding storms, it was about becoming the mountain that weather cannot move. The scattered lessons of the past cohere into a unified, diamond-hard core of sovereign authority. He is no longer afraid of the dark, because he has learned how to light the fire within it. Consider the legendary traditions of master shipwrights in ancient Phoenicia, who built the vessels that dominated the ancient Mediterranean. These master builders did not select the soft, fast-growing cedar trees that flourished in the warm, sheltered valleys where soil was rich and water was abundant. Wood grown in such luxury was deceptive. It appeared thick and grand, but its grain was loose, soft, and brittle, destined to splinter at the first violent strike of a winter gale. Instead, the master shipwrights climbed high into the jagged, wind-scoured ridges of Mount Lebanon, where trees clung desperately to sheer rock faces. These ancient cedars grew slowly, beaten by relentless gales, starved of deep soil, and forced to drive their roots deep into freezing stone just to survive. Their wood was gnarled, scarred, twisted by storms, and dense with trapped resin. To the untrained eye, these harsh mountain trees looked inferior, ugly, and difficult to carve. Yet, when the master shipwright shaped them into the keel and ribs of an ocean-faring galleon, those hulls possessed legendary mythical strength. A ship built from valley wood shattered against the reefs. A ship built from mountain cedar absorbed the fury of typhoons, flexing with the waves, healing its stress points with resin, and riding out the worst catastrophes the sea could conjure. The tree did not become unbreakable because its life was easy. It became unbreakable because its environment forced it to conquer every ounce of resistance it encountered. The scars were not its weakness. The scars were its structural integrity. To step forward into your new trajectory today, you must seal this entire philosophy into the very marrow of your daily existence. You are no longer the man who reacts to a heavy day with panic, who allows an unguided monologue to rewrite his identity, or who drifts silently off course in the fog of complacency. You stand fully awake, anchored in your center, armed with the sacred tools of sovereign mastery, the pattern interruption, stopping the descent of a heavy day before it names you, the cognitive wedge, separating the raw event from the toxic meaning, the internal monologue firewall, directing your thoughts rather than being mastered by them, the calibration mindset, treating resistance as your greatest teacher, the inner reset, returning to your center before you take your next step. The unshakable anchor, remaining the quiet eye in the center of worldly chaos. Carry this final majestic affirmation with you as you cross the threshold into your unwritten future. I do not wish for an easy road. I forge an unbreakable path. Your journey is no longer dictated by the fluctuating weather of circumstance, the opinions of the crowd, or the phantom whispers of self-doubt. You are the author, the navigator, and the master of your domain. The heavy days will come, for they are the rhythm of human life, but they will no longer defeat you. They will only remind you of how deep your roots run into the unshakable earth. The manuscript of this chapter is complete, but the grand manuscript of your life is only now entering its most magnificent volume. Step forward into the dawn. The path is clear, the anchor is set, and the horizon belongs to you.